Good afternoon and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's From Selection to Award, the Post-Selection Process for FRA Grants webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take you on a tour of the items you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you have problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure that you are not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you are using a web browser, exit the webinar and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. In the Troubleshooting Tips pod, at the bottom left of your dashboard are some internet, network, video, and audio troubleshooting steps to ensure that participants can both hear and see the presentation. Next to the Troubleshooting Tips pod is the Web Links pod. To view the web links, double-click the title of the link. On the bottom right of the Adobe Connect dashboard is the Technical Support Chat pod. This is where you can ask our support team questions about any technical issues you are having. Above the Web Links pod is the Questions for Presenters pod. Actually, this is above the Technical Support Chat pod. And the Questions for a Presenter pod is for the Q&A session. This is where you can ask questions that will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. And we want to thank all of you who submitted those pre-webinar questions. Please note we're also going to be conducting polls during the webinar. Please ensure that you are not viewing the presentation in full screen mode to participate in the polls. Please note that a recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to FRA's website in about a week. The presentation file will be available about 24 hours from now on the FRA website. And as we just mentioned, some polling questions. We're going to start with our first two. Our first question is, what type of organization do you represent? A, state, including DC. B, interstate compact. C, public agency or publicly chartered authority. D, local government. E, Amtrak. F, industry consultant. G, tribal. Or H, other. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. It looks like we have 27% come from state. D, local government, that's about 9%. E, Amtrak, that was 9% as well. Industry consultant, F, was 23%. Tribal was 0%. And other is 15%. Our next polling question is, did you participate in any previous FRA discretionary grant program webinars? A, yes, I've participated in a live FRA webinar. B, yes, I've watched a recorded FRA webinar online. Or C, no, I have not previously attended or watched any FRA webinars. We'll just give that just a moment more. All right, let's go ahead and end that poll. It looks like 51% have participated in a live FRA webinar, so welcome back. 9% have watched a recorded webinar, and 40% have not previously attended or watched any FRA webinars. So we welcome you to the live webinar and look forward to hearing from you all today with any questions that you have for our presenters. Today we welcome Michael Longley, the Project Management and Oversight Division Chief for Federal Railroad Administration. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Mary, and hello and welcome to everybody joining us today. I appreciate the time. As Mary said, my name is Mike Longley. I'm the Chief of FRA's Project Management and Oversight Division, and I am excited to be here with you today as we host this important webinar, really the first of its kind that focuses on post-selection activities for our discretionary grant programs such as CRISI, FedState, RAISE, and Infra. Just to be clear, one thing this webinar won't focus on, however, is the current FY21 CRISI NOFO or the application process related to it that is on the street currently. We recently hosted a webinar specifically on that program, and that is available for viewing and download on our FRA webinar page. As you've already noticed, there will be a few polling questions throughout, and should you have specific questions during the webinar, we really encourage you to use that chat pod within your Adobe Connect application, and we'll do our best to respond by the end of the webinar. So I'd quickly like to introduce our speakers today before we really get into the meat of the webinar. We've got Carla Moffitt, a supervisory transportation analyst overseeing projects in the western third of the United States. Laura Schick, a supervisory environmental protection specialist. John Johnson, a senior attorney advisor in our Office of Chief Counsel. Matthew Laura, a supervisory grants management specialist in our grants management division. And finally, Lynn Everett, a supervisory transportation analyst overseeing projects in the central region of the United States. We've got a pretty jam-packed agenda for you today. And we're going to go into a little bit of a deep dive on a number of items, including key components of our grant lifecycle, specific details on critical pre-obligation activities and prerequisites. We'll have a review of post-award activities that include grant monitoring, Buy America, reporting, and our invoicing process. At the end of today's webinar, we'll have time for any questions, like I said. We have the chat pod available, so go ahead and ask them if they're timely during our presentation. And then just before we get into to Carla's slides, I did want to kind of set the context for how important the information in this webinar really is. We have over 350 active grant projects, or just close to 350 in our portfolio today, which represents almost $2.7 billion in infrastructure investment. As you see on the slide, we've invested in a variety of project types, including safety-focused projects through 1,000+ grade crossing related investments, over $1 billion specifically in intercity passenger rail projects, such as rolling stock procurement. And these figures are positioned to really grow with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in front of the Senate today. And we're confident that the information contained in today's webinar will position you all for success should you receive these dollars through FRA's various grant programs. So with that, I'll turn it to my colleague, Carla Moffitt, to kick things off. So thanks for joining, everybody.
Great, thanks, Mike. So the Office of Infrastructure Investment manages all of FRA's discretionary grant programs, including those that are administered by the Office of Secretary of Transportation. So those would include the RACE program, which was previously known as BUILD or TIGER, and also the INFRA program that was previously known as FASTLANE. As Mike mentioned, the information that we'll cover in the webinar today will also generally apply to some of the former programs that we have had, such as CRISI, State of Good Repair, road relocation, and things of that nature. Typically, the grant program selections are bucketed into different project types or tracks. If you're looking at the NOFO, you may see them referred to as tracks that the project sponsor or the applicant can apply for during the application phase. So we have the pre-NEPA, which is previously referred to as planning. This includes conceptual engineering, which is roughly 15%, design, planning analysis, such as service development plans, ridership and revenue forecasts, and things of that nature. Then we have preliminary engineering. This roughly goes up to 30% completion for the design of the project itself. We have environmental clearance, or NEPA, as we'll get into a little bit later. This includes the signed NEPA clearance documentation that is necessary for all FRA grant programs and projects. It'll also include final design, which goes for engineering up to 100%. And then construction, of course, is the actual construction of the project. We also have grant programs for selections for safety. And depending on the discretionary grant program itself, safety-specific grants may be managed by the Office of Infrastructure Investment in a very close coordination with the Office of Safety. So these would include our trespasser-related grants and our positive train control grants that we've had in the past. And we also have program selections under research and development as well. While we reference all of our federally funded projects as grants, they can actually take the form of traditional grant agreement or a cooperative agreement. As the name applies, a cooperative agreement is an agreement that has substantially more assistance and involvement from the FRA. So while it's not a hard and fast rule, cooperative agreements are seen in our safety and pre-NEPA/planning related project tasks or tracks. The assigned project manager along with the FRA project team, will determine which agreement type fits the selected project based on the predicted level of FRA involvement. And so this goes into a little bit more about the FRA project oversight team that I just mentioned and the organizational structure. So each selected project in an assigned project region will have an assigned project team. The project team is comprised of subject matter experts from across FRA that may include grant management, legal counsel, transportation planners, Office of Safety specialists, engineers, environmental protection specialists, financial analysts, and in some cases, our monitoring and technical assistant contractors. The assigned project manager is responsible for bringing together the necessary subject matter experts and guiding the team through the project implementation phase and providing ongoing monitoring and oversight of the project through the various project phases. So each of the 7 distinct regions that you see on the right in the very colorful slide are based on a geographic area. So as I mentioned before, each geographic area has a distinct group of subject matter experts that provide regionally based expertise and are compiled into the project team. So now we'll go into the grant lifecycle and approximate timeframes. For those of you who have seen, whether live or have watched our webinars previously, especially those that mentioned the NOFO webinars of the past, you will be very familiar with this slide, although it's a little differently colored this time. This slide has been featured in our recent webinars, and it generally outlines the time frames for each of the project phases in the grant lifecycle. So the grant lifecycle is generally broken into 4 distinct phases. You will see 3 on the screen here. The application cycle, which of course is not shown because we are not touching on that aspect right now, is the start of one of the phases. For more information on applications and particularly those related to the CRISI fiscal year 21 webinar, please go to our website that has the posting of that webinar there. The next project or grant lifecycle is from project selection to award. So this includes creating the grant agreement, the terms and conditions that make up the grant agreement, NEPA requirements, which we'll go into a little bit later, and everything that is needed as far as prerequisites before we can get to executing the grant agreement. So once the grant agreement is executed, or obligated as we call it, you will move into the post-obligation phase. This can last anywhere from 2 to 5 years, but it generally does depend on the project itself. Each project is different, so we do have projects that are moved a little bit quicker through the post-obligation cycle, and we also have projects that last a lot longer. So the post-obligation cycle is the achievement of the scope of work outlined in the grant agreement and the application. So it's really important that everything that you are that you want to get done during the project itself, that would be under the grant agreement, needs to be entered into the grant agreement, of course, and that also relies on what is entered into the application. So it all does track back to that application that you would submit before you are selected. And during the post-obligation phase, it's the grant administration and the oversight and monitoring of FRA. So making sure that invoices and deliverables are submitted, any oversight and monitoring that we do, whether that is routine monitoring or our annual monitoring or site visits, as well as any recurring meetings with the FRA. And then the last cycle that we have is the closeout phase. This is when the final information is submitted to FRA, and FRA does the official closeout of the project. So it's the final performance report, final invoicing, all the documentation has been received, and the outcomes and benefits have been tracked. So I'll go into some of the pre-obligation activities and prerequisites that I mentioned before. One of the main ones that you will notice is the railroad agreement. So on one of the main prerequisites, like I said, is commonly referred to as a railroad agreement. You may also see it referred to as 22905. Here in the government, we do like our acronyms and shortening of names. So 22905 or railroad agreement are referring to the same thing. This is an agreement that FRA requires between the applicant, so who submitted the application, and the railroad right-of-way owner for the following instances: for compensations of use, for assurances regarding both existing and future capacity for freight and or passenger operations, assurances that the collective bargaining agreements will remain in place for railroad employees, and assurances that the applicant complies with various liability requirements consistent with U.S. Code 28103. So this includes the limitations, contractual obligations, mandatory coverage, things of that nature. So like I said, the railroad agreement generally is required for any project that is going to be entering into final design and or construction under the grant agreement, and in which the applicant or the grantee is not the railroad right-of-way owner. There are instances, however, where the railroad agreement does not apply. It is generally not required for planning, preliminary engineering, or NEPA only. So if the project scope is those 3 items, generally not applied for those. Also generally not applied for onboard positive train control installation. I say generally because we do look at every project and make sure that it does, whether it does or does not apply for the railroad agreement. So this is not a hard and fast rule that is here. Also for commuter rail transportation, that is defined by U.S. Code 24102, is generally not applied to for the railroad agreement, as well as the Alaska Railroad and its contractors and Amtrak access right-of-way, rights to railroad right-of-way facilities under current law. So in recent years, the completion of the railroad agreement can and has been one of the longest lead items as far as obtaining grant obligation. If the applicant is not aware that such a requirement exists or expected of them, it can be even longer. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring it up during this webinar, during the post-selection webinar, because even though it is mentioned in the NOFO, for which under the programs that it applies for, there are some instances where the grantees that have been selected are unaware if a railroad agreement will apply to them. As I mentioned before, FRA must provide acceptance of the executed railroad agreement prior to the FRA grant agreement reaching obligation. So this requirement will require close coordination between the applicant and the FRA project manager and the FRA legal counsel to 1, determine if a railroad agreement is actually needed, and 2, for FRA to provide that acceptance of the railroad agreement once executed. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Laura Schick to talk about NEPA.
Thanks, Carla. Welcome, everyone. So yes, we're going to talk about the environmental review pretty quickly. So anytime a federal agency is giving out a grant or a loan or a permit or a license or really any sort of approval for a project, we have to consider the environmental impacts of that project. And we do this pursuant to a variety of laws. The one you may have heard about is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. It dates back to New Year's Day, 1970. So you've probably heard of it by now. But as a part of a NEPA review, we do look at a wide variety of other laws. They're all here on the slide. And we do this environmental review so that we are taking a hard look at potential project impacts on the environment. And that's both sort of the human environment as well as the natural biological environment. And the take-home message here is that NEPA review must be conducted for all FRA grant-funded rail projects. And the first step when we do NEPA is we determine the class of action, and that's really the anticipated level of impacts and then the associated documentation to address those impacts. At FRA, we have 3 NEPA classes of actions. We have categorical exclusions, we have environmental assessments, which conclude with a finding of no significant impact or a FONSI, and we also have environmental impact statements, which conclude with a record of decision. By far, the categorical exclusions or CEs are what we do the most of. These are pretty typical when we have any sort of maintenance or repair or replacement project of existing rail infrastructure. We would do an EA, for example, if there's more than one way to build or to locate a project, you would want to do an EA to evaluate various alternatives and also to seek public input. We would do an EIS, for example, for a brand new greenfield construction, such as if a grantee wanted to build a brand new rail line. We also may have to do an EA for a project that may initially seem like a CE, but it's got certain project-specific impacts, such as being located in an environmentally sensitive area, such as in a wetland or an area where protected species are present. And again, like I just said, CEs are by far the most frequently applied NEPA category of action. And the full list of our CEs are in our regulations, which are on our website. But this bulleted list shows you the variety of activities which typically do qualify for a CE. And to do a CE, there must be minimal environmental issues and no extraordinary circumstances. So you will hear this term environmental review, NEPA sort of interchangeably, but the key thing again is that NEPA must be approved before FRA can obligate a grant. And it's both responsibilities are both on FRA and on the grantees. Really, you need to be aware that NEPA exists. It's required for all of our grants, and factor in the time frame to do NEPA. It may seem like a routine project, but if it's involving, for example, protected species habitat, or you're in a historic district, it may take several months to get through the NEPA process. So just plan accordingly into your timelines. And as Carla touched on, depending on the program, grant funds may be used for a variety of things. So if the grant itself is actually funding NEPA, then on our end, we would just do a pretty minimal administrative step to obligate the grant. And then the grantee would use the grant money to prepare the NEPA document, which could be itself a CE, an EA, or an EAS, depending on the type of project that you are doing the NEPA analysis on. And if you are looking for a grant that's paying for construction, then we cannot obligate the grant until NEPA is done. And in that case, depending on the scope of the application, grantees may be responsible for preparing the NEPA document on their own, or they may be able to use the grant funds. It really just depends on what the scope of the application is. If the grant is paying for the full suite of things from PE, NEPA up to FB construction, we would obligate a portion of the grant so that the grantee has the money to do NEPA. But then again, we would not allow the grantee to proceed with construction until the NEPA is done for the construction impacts of the project. Another law that you may have heard about, particularly with railroads, is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This is a law dating back to 1966 that protects historic properties and cultural resources. And this can include railroad infrastructure itself, so bridges, tunnels, passenger stations, and even interlocking towers and power plants, or entire segments of rail line. So again, 106 is going to be encountered for many of our projects, if not all of them, because of just the age of the nation's rail systems. And historic properties also include non-rail properties in the vicinity of rights-of-way, which could be commercial and residential districts, municipal buildings, and archaeological sites. So when you're planning your projects, just be thinking about what is out there that's 40, 45, 50 years old. 50 is what the regs say, but because projects could take several years to actually plan and construct, we encourage folks to look at properties that are 40 to 45 years old, because they could be 50 years old by the time you are constructing your project. And again, this does include rail infrastructure itself. And because we know that railroads are old, and therefore lots of the infrastructure is 50 years old or much older, we worked with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation pursuant to a requirement back in the FAST Act to develop what we call it's called a program comment. Don't worry about the terminology, it's really an exemption, but we have a very comprehensive list of maintenance, repair, and upgrade activities that, just based on past experience, are likely to have minimal effects to historic properties, historic rail properties in existing right-of-way, and therefore a 106 review is not needed. So examples would be if your project is just track and tie replacement, it's going to be exempt from 106 review. We document that in-house. We no longer have to consult with state historic preservation officers. That one's pretty easy. If you are renovating a historic train station, some of that project elements may be exempt, others may not be, because we want to preserve the historic character of the station itself. So we can apply the program comment to certain elements, but maybe not to the whole project. And then we also would have to do standard 106 review if you are, for example, having to acquire right-of-way, which would require the demolition and acquisition of properties that are not rail related. So if you are acquiring residences or commercial buildings, then 106 would apply to any impacts to properties outside of the right of way. But again, if you're doing something that's really maintenance of rail infrastructure in the right of way, it's very likely to be exempt from 106 review, which is a huge time savings compared to our past environmental review process. Oh, sorry. Something else to be aware of. Often if, FRA is providing money for our project, there may be other agency involvements through permits or licenses. We often are coordinating with the Army Corps, the Coast Guard, or the FCC. All federal agencies have our own environmental review requirements, but we don't want to be duplicating efforts. So we do try and coordinate. We will enter into agreement with another agency to establish a lead agency, or we may be able to adopt another agency's NEPA document. So if you know that you've got another agency involvement, let us know so we can begin that coordination as early as possible. And I only talked about NEPA for a few minutes here. We have entire webinars on NEPA, on Section 106, et cetera. I encourage you to go to our webpage. We have recorded ones on there. We offer them throughout the year as well. So please register for future ones if you're interested. We also have a companion guide on there for how to fill out our CE worksheets. And you can email us at our fraenvironment@dot.gov if you have any questions as you navigate the NEPA process. So thanks.
Thanks, Laura. And we'll touch very briefly on the trespassing related capital grants. So as mentioned before, the grants that are related to trespassing will require close coordination between both the Office of Infrastructure Investment and the Office of Railroad Safety. So that does involve an additional person to the project team that may not be included on some of our more traditional projects that we have. The grants that are selected for final design and or construction, so whether that is the solely final design construction or they include those tracks within the scope of work, will still require the typical grant prerequisites for obligations, such as preliminary engineering and NEPA. So these still must be completed prior to us executing the grant agreement, reaching grant obligation for the trespassing grants. In addition, the needs assessment would fall under the preliminary engineering, and NEPA, as Laura mentioned, is still NEPA. Will not be covered or included in the scope of the grant, generally for the trespassing related capital projects. Additional components that may be needed and sort of wrapped up into the prerequisites in order for the trespassing related capital projects in order for them to reach grant obligation would or may include a needs assessment, community stakeholder identification, data analysis, things of that nature. So because of this, the Office of Safety recommends that the project sponsor utilizes what they call the CARE model. So under this model, additional items that would be needed for the execution of the grant agreement, like I mentioned, would include the community stakeholder identification, the analysis of data to identify the root cause of the problem, determining the best response to implement the solution, and evaluation of the impact and processes for the solution. So I know I very briefly touched on the trespassing related grants and projects here, but for more information, please contact Mike Griskowitz, at dot.gov. He'll be able to provide additional information on the trespassing related capital projects that the FRA administers. So while we are still in the pre-obligation phase of the grant lifecycle, one of the main components is the creation of the grant agreement. So the grant agreement can be compiled into these 5 to 7 different components that must be completed prior to the grant agreement being executed, and they are generally agreed upon between the FRA and the project sponsor. So the statement of work contains the general outline of the scope of the project and describes what the project will achieve or accomplish, project location, and it outlines any deliverables needed for each of the project tasks, such as engineering or project management. The budget, as you may be able to guess, is a high-level breakdown of financial contributions to the project, including the federal funding contributions. This document captures the match requirements and outlines which task or tasks that the federal funding contribution will be attributed towards. It is generally the guiding document for a detailed budget that would be required as part of one of the first deliverables and for future invoicing for the grant agreement itself. The schedule outlines the high-level schedule of the tasks for the project, including when the period of performance will start and end, as well as due dates for deliverables that were decided within the statement of work. It does not include due dates for project reports, as we'll touch on a little bit later. The terms and conditions are set by FRA legal and are determined based on the grant program, the funding authorization, and funding authority. It includes information such as reporting requirement timelines, compliance provisions such as contractor flow down, construction compliance, and things of that nature. And then we already touched on the railroad agreement and the NEPA prerequisites that are needed to create the general grant agreement itself. One that I will go into a little bit more detail on is the performance measures. So as part of the FACTS Act, performance measures are required for all FRA discretionary grants. They are mutually agreed upon between FRA and the project sponsor and are used to collect and assess overall project performance. Performance measures are typically captured prior to the grant agreement execution, and we call that the baseline performance measure. And then they are updated either at the time of project completion or up to 5 years post-project completion, depending on the performance measure itself. So FRA has a list of standard performance measures that are include some of what you see on the right-hand side of the slide itself. So passenger counts, grade separation or grade crossing closures, addition to track miles, decrease in travel time, slow order miles, and gross tonnage. The performance measures and reporting timeframe is unique for each project and may include others that are not on the list. So coming up with the performance measures is something that is done mutually between FRA and the project sponsor. And both parties do need to agree on the performance measures that are going to be captured, as well as the timeline for reports prior to the grant execution.
All right, so now we have a few more polls to ask you. Our first question here for this section is, are you a current or previous FRA grantee? A, yes, current grantee. B, yes, previous grantee. Or C, no, I have not had any direct experience as an FRA grantee. We'll just give that a few seconds more. All right, thank you all so much. It looks like we have about 50% are current grantees, 8% are previous grantees, and 42% have not had any direct experience as an FRA grantee. All right, our next question is, are you planning to submit an application for FRA federal finance assistance under current or future notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs? A, yes, I plan to submit an application. B, no, I do not plan to submit an application. Or C, I am undecided on whether I will submit an application. All right. Going to go ahead and end that poll. About 70% say yes, they plan to submit an application. About 8% saying no, I do not plan to submit an application. And 22% are currently undecided. All right, now we're going to go back over to Matthew.
All right, good afternoon, or I assume good morning for some still. My name is Matthew Laura. I'm a supervisor in the Grants and Program Management Division at FRA. So if you remember the chart that Carla had spoke to and shown a little bit earlier, so far everything we've covered has been in that pre-obligation phase. That was roughly 6 to 15 months, depending on your type of project and whether or not, how advanced the NEPA is and whether or not railroad agreements are in place. We're going to shift gears now and move into the next phase of the life cycle, the post-obligation, which, again, Carla had a pretty broad range there. We said 2 to 6 years. That's really dependent on just the type of project and how ready the recipient is to move into, that phase of the the grant at application or at obligation. So that could be a large phase here, a large period of time. First thing we're going to hit on is, when we say post obligation, that means, as Carla just pointed out there with that circle chart, we have all those documents together in an agreement that has now been signed by the recipient and by FRA. Within that grant agreement, you're going to have the terms and conditions that are provided by FRA, written by FRA, and generally standard by program. Within those terms and conditions, there are several provisions that need to be flowed down to your subcontractors that generally are building the project or doing any construction, etc. One of them that we'll talk in detail about is the Buy America compliance, but there are most of those terms or provisions in the terms and conditions need to be flowed down in any agreements you put in place with a subgrantee or contractor. For grant oversight and monitoring compliance, very similarly to how FRA is responsible for keeping an eye on our federal funds, we will oversee and monitor the direct recipients. The direct recipients will be responsible for overseeing and monitoring any contractors or subrecipients. When we speak to certifying reimbursement requests, again, the contractors will submit reimbursement requests up to the direct recipient. They will review and certify those prior to submitting that to FRA for reimbursement. We'll talk a little more in detail about the payment process in a couple slides. And then obviously there are reporting requirements and deliverables, as Carla had mentioned. We'll get into a little bit more detail with these as well, but that's a responsibility that you must be reporting up to FRA, both programmatic and financial type information. So first, we're going to go into a little bit of additional detail on the Buy America compliance, and John and I believe Lynn will be speaking to you guys about this.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you, John.
Okay, great. So my name is John Johnson. I work in FRA's Office of Chief Counsel. So yes, so for these grants, Buy America, which is found at 49 USC 22905A, will apply. The policy, which everyone hears a lot about, is that taxpayer dollars, federal financial assistance awards, should maximize the use of goods, products, and materials produced in the United States. You'll see that in the executive orders about Buy America. The requirement requires, it talks about three different areas. It talks about steel, iron, and manufactured goods. So steel and iron products such as rail need to be manufactured in the United States. And for rail and structural steel, the steel itself must be domestic steel. For manufactured goods, which include things like rolling stock and systems in buildings like fire alarm systems, the manufactured goods must be manufactured in the United States. And it's too much to get into on this webinar, but the way that we view manufactured goods is, for example, rolling stock. There are end products like a rolling stock or fire alarm system. The end product must be manufactured in the United States, and the components of the end product, for example, the fire poles, or the rolling stock, for example, the wheels or the doors, those are components, and those components must be manufactured in the United States. And the other thing to note is that the requirement applies to the whole project, including the portion of the project that is not funded with FRA dollars. There's always a lot of talk about Buy America and a lot of questions, which is understandable. We view that complying with Buy America does not need to be a barrier to your project, but it really is something that you want to get ahead of. And one way to try to get ahead of Buy America issues is to start at the design phase and really work with your designers and your project folks, and if you have procurement people, that they understand the requirement, and that, obviously you, the grantee, typically is not the one making the product, so you're going to be relying on contractors and manufacturers. So really starting early and understanding that. And so we really encourage you to get going as soon as possible. And then also, obviously, with your procurement documents, you want to make sure that when you go out for bid, that the procurement documents adequately explain the requirement so that you're able to address any Buy America issues before you enter into contracts with contractors or manufacturers. And I'll pass it to Lynn.
Thank you, John. So waivers are a part of the regulation for Buy America and are part of the filtering process to make sure that you've exhausted reasonable opportunities to secure American-made products and components for your project. FRA will pursue waiver with you for non-availability, meaning the product is not available from a domestic source. Waivers are project specific, however, meaning that there's no blanket waiver. So, if you find that you have to include foreign-made product in your project, you need to let us know as soon as possible so that we can work together. Be prepared to show your research and tell the story about why you need to invest in something that's not American, and explain all the efforts that you've gone to secure US-made goods at the beginning of the project. Let's see. We do not pursue waivers for public interest at FRA. Ours are specifically for non-availability. So if you need to explain what your product is going to do that's going to benefit the project overall. Again, tell the story about, is it going to lead to more American investment in jobs, or will you be encouraging investment in these products to be made in the US in the future based on testing or executing in your project. Work as soon as you know that you have non-American components or you're looking for to file a waiver, work with your project manager at the very beginning of the process. As John mentioned, before you get into design, if you know you're going to have an issue, let us know, and we will work with you to pursue the best course of action. It is possible to get a waiver, but it is not guaranteed, and it may take a very long time. It goes through a lot of review and public comment period. So to sum up, design American. If not, have a good reason. It's possible to get a waiver, but it needs to be compelling, and work with us as soon as you can before awarding any contracts. And for further information, see our website. And I'll hand it back to Carla.
Great, thanks, Lynn. So we'll go into FRA oversight and monitoring just a bit. So the oversight and monitoring by FRA is comprised of 3 distinct areas. So that's the compliance, the programmatic, and the financial. So compliance monitoring speaks to the requirements outlined within the grant agreement, including all terms and conditions. Also includes Buy America compliance that we just touched on, contractor flow down provisions, reporting requirements, when to notify FRA, and things of that nature. These requirements are standard based on the grant program and cannot be edited by the project sponsor or the FRA project team. The programmatic compliance, the programmatic monitoring refers to specifically to the adherence of scope and schedule, including the quality and timely submittal of the deliverables outlined within the statement of work. And these requirements are mutually agreed upon between the FRA project team and the project sponsor. And last but not least, the financial oversight and monitoring speaks to the financial management of the project by the project sponsor or the recipient, also known as the grantee. It includes invoices and expenditures and adherence to the project budget. Financial oversight is a combination of the mutually agreed upon budgetary items within the grant agreement. So as I mentioned before, that budget table that makes up the grant agreement, and the accurate reporting of financial information, submitting reimbursement requests, and the overall financial management as outlined in the terms and conditions. So one part of the oversight and monitoring that FRA does manage is the reporting and deliverable requirements. So a deliverable is a document that is developed by the grant team to carry out the purpose of the project, and it serves as one of the key components for FRA's monitoring and oversight program. So these deliverables provide visibility to the FRA project team on project progress and demonstrates the grantee's ability to deliver a project within scope, schedule, and budget. A report, on the other hand, is a standardized document that is usually collected on a recurring basis, or at least on a timetable, that is also completed by the grantee to provide the FRA or the federal awarding agency financial and performance information. Reports are standard for all grants and cooperative agreements, but deliverables may vary based on the project type, the grantee experience, the project level of complexity, and FRA's necessary oversight. So some examples of deliverables that you may see in a grant or cooperative agreement include the project management plan, project agreements. This does not include the railroad agreement. These would be additional agreements that are needed between the grantee, any sub-grantees, any railroads that are included in here that would be necessary for the FRA to review as part of the project oversight. NEPA documentation that Laura touched on. This would be included for any project that has a project scope that includes completing NEPA within the project scope. So if the project scope or the scope of the grant agreement, itself is for final design and construction or any activities post NEPA completion, NEPA documentation would not be required as a deliverable. Preliminary engineering plans, final design plans, and the final performance report. So your grant agreement may contain some or all the deliverables that are noted here, or it may include additional deliverables. As we mentioned before, each project is different, and we do try to treat all of the projects and all the deliverables associated with each project on a one-on-one basis. The deliverables are determined by the FRA project manager in coordination with the FRA project team, the subject matter experts, and then are mutually agreed upon with the applicant in the grant team. Before the grant agreement is executed, the FRA project team and the applicant or the grantee will mutually agree upon the deliverables that are in here, as well as the time frame for submitting these deliverables itself. The first and last deliverables that are on the list, so the project management plan and the final performance report, are generally always required in every single grant agreement that we have. You'll notice that the final performance report is listed on both the deliverable side and the reporting side. This is one example of where one document will satisfy both the deliverable requirement and the reporting requirement. And I'll turn it over to Matthew to go over some of the reporting information.
Thanks, Carla. So this is Matthew Laura again. And as Carla had mentioned earlier, whereas deliverables are often one-time submissions to fulfill that requirement, reports more often than not are a recurring requirement. The first two, you'll notice both are quarterly. The progress report is exactly that. You guys can provide us the status of project progress, telling us, the story of how your project is coming along and how far you are in each of the tasks or phases. Versus obviously the federal financial report is all about dollars and cents. It is, how much have you expended on the grant, how much have you paid out to your contractors, how much have you requested from FRA. So really the progress report is more narrative and quantitative in nature versus the financial report is qualitative in nature for the progress report and quantitative dollars and cents for the federal financial report. The final performance report, as Carla has just mentioned, is actually on both sides, and this report will generally meet a deliverable for you, but that is a one-time at the end of the grant performance report, again telling us about the completion and status of your project. The performance measures report, as we had mentioned on performance measures earlier, this is where you're telling us about the improvements that are resulting from your project. So your performance measurements report is going to, again, tell us that we have, seen the benefits or realized the benefits that were expected from your project that was applied for. That is not an exhaustive list, but it is generally the ones that you will see on FRA grants across the board for all grants. You should see all 4 of these. Carla, I talked a little bit about we have what we call routine and scheduled monitoring. So annual monitoring is our scheduled monitoring. It comes in two different sources. We can do a desk review or a site review, but both of them are an in-depth review to see, how the status of your project is going, and this can occur anywhere within the post-obligation phase. Generally we don't want to do it right after obligation. We want to let you guys get your feet on the ground, get moving into the project. But at any point during that post-obligation phase, you guys can be selected for annual monitoring. We have a risk model that we will use on an annual basis to select which grants are going to be monitored, whether it be desk or site. And some of the things that we're looking for is just, we want to get a cross-cut of the various grant programs, project types, high dollar and low dollar. We want to have regional diversity, see projects across the country in the different programs. So overall, we have, I believe it's over 20 items that go into the risk model for us to figure out, who's going to get a monitoring visit each year. If you're selected for a desk review, that means we have a standard set of checklists per program that we will go over in a telephone or video call. It's all done, over the computer or the phone. Versus a site visit is FRA will show up in site to physically, inspect the project itself, look at the Buy America stamps, see the rail in the ground or the building construction, et cetera, whatever it is your project may be doing. But we will be boots on the ground at your location, at the project location. Again, there's another set of checklists that are standard across each program that we would be doing in person with the grantee for a site visit. These are not pop-up visits. They're not aha, caught you type visits. We communicate with the recipients in advance. We schedule them with the recipients, and we come out and we'll work with you guys to do it at a time that works for both FRA and the recipient. What are the benefits of annual monitoring? First we're going to hit on unfortunately the problems that can occur. It enables us to come out and see if there are project problems or any projects that require additional support. If there are problems uncovered, it can be either an area of interest, which would be something a little more minor, or a significant finding, which could seriously jeopardize project completion. In either case, you'll notice that we're going to have corrective action plans and potential additional training available to you guys, or for any recipients that would have areas of interest or significant findings. Just depending on the level of the finding or area of interest, will determine whether or not we have a full-blown corrective action plan or just provide additional training opportunities. But either way, we want to be able to, increase compliance with, reporting and deliverables. Obviously, Buy America, NEPA. If any project is off track, the intent of this monitoring is to get them back on track towards project completion and getting those measurable goals, met. What are the overall benefits? One of the biggest ones is whether there's a problem or not is lessons learned. Over doing these programs over several years, we can take best practices from those that are going well, or the ones that do have problems. We can, work on avoiding those same problems in the future. So by doing that, when we see a problem, we'll develop some guidance and training to try and avoid that in the future. For those folks that don't have problems, we'll see why they didn't run into similar problems, and we'll share those best practices among our recipient community. So again, sometimes this is not always as I said, aha, got you, trying to find something wrong. We also want to come out and see the ones that are running really smoothly and figure out what can we apply to other grants in the program. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about invoicing and getting your reimbursements from FRA. Obviously, that's the benefit of the grant programs is that we're providing the funds for you guys to complete this work that needs to be done. So all of our grant programs are generally on a reimbursement basis. It should go without saying that only eligible costs for items in the statement of work and that are allowable under the grant program will be reimbursed for. So project work will be complete. When I say reimbursement basis, that means the project work will be completed. The direct recipient will pay their contractors or their vendors, and then will come in and seek reimbursement from FRA. Project work that occurs prior to obligation, when both parties sign that grant agreement, are generally not eligible unless approved in writing by FRA. Your reimbursement requests can be delayed or even denied if you are delinquent on any of your recurring reporting or deliverables with a specific due date. So ensure that those things are up to date before you come in and submit your reimbursement request. And then this question actually came up in the chat. We generally, again, unless there is prior written approval by FRA, your federal portion should be represented in each reimbursement request. Meaning, if you submitted a request for a 50-50 grant, 50% federal share, 50% recipient share, each reimbursement will come in and request 50% of the expenditures for that period of time. So ensure your matching requirements are met within each reimbursement request, unless otherwise approved in writing by FRA. All of your recipient match funds are bound by the same terms and conditions and same requirements as the federal funds. So in order to be eligible for recipient match, it must have been eligible for federal funds as well. We're just splitting the dollar, whether it be 50-50 or 80-20, whatever the recipient matching share may be for your particular grant. So that's our invoicing process. This is done through a system, Delphi. It is the e-invoicing iSupplier module. We have some training out on our website there as well. If you just Google DOT e-invoicing, you can find our training sites for invoicing and reimbursement. And I think we're going to kick it back over. I think we have some wrap-up polls.
We're going to go to poll number 5 now. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Do you have a clear understanding of the expectations and processes for FRA discretionary grant awards post-selection? Yes, I have a clear understanding. That's A. B is somewhat, and C is no, I would like further information. All right, thank you all so much. Our next question is a short answer poll. It says, what information would you like to learn more about related to the post-selection process? And so what you'll need to do is type your answer into the bottom and then hit that up arrow with the circle around it to submit your answer. All right, I see we've got some answers rolling in. Thank you so much. Again, type your answer into the bottom there and then hit that up arrow to submit it. Probably leave this open for about another 20 seconds. So if you're in the process of typing, go ahead and finish typing and go ahead and hit that up arrow. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. Thank you all for joining us today for the From Selection to Award, the Post-Selection Process for FRA Grants webinar. Today's webinar will be available on FRA's website in the next week. I do want to state that down in the web links pod, you'll see that first link there is the FRA's webinar site. So if you want to go ahead and open that up so that you can bookmark it into your browser, you can go ahead and do that. The webinar will end in about 20 seconds, so please copy or screenshot the contact information on the screen. The webinar has ended. Thank you so much for joining us.